All right, so let's move on to the significance of the election of 1864 and its dramatic and direct influence on the victory of the war itself. Okay, it's really important to understand the significance of this election. We've called other elections. The election of 1800, we've called a revolution of sorts. We've called, certain political events in history as having more emphasis on other items in history that correlate to it in similar ways. So there really shouldn't be any difference between that mindset and this mindset. Only that the Civil War, because of its enormity, because of its size, places the election of 1864 in the same sort of correlates the same way. So in association, it's that much bigger. Okay, scale. So the election of 1864 is just that if I haven't put this out there enough yet, again, it's just such an important election to understand. So dramatic and direct influence on victory in the war itself. All right. So moving right into the two opposing sides and their respective platforms. So this is, again, platform is what they stand on. Okay, and like a physical platform would have like wooden planks in it, these are their planks. This is what they stand on. This is what they stand for. So in 1864, the Democrats would have stood for the following. Okay, particularly of Southerners. Okay, but not of all, but not only Southerners. The Democratic Party has become the rival of the Republicans, right? Who have absorbed all of these other groups we spoke about that had emerged, especially during the 1850s, but 1840s and 50s. Okay, and so the Republican Party has basically become the party of the war, right? Fighting the war. The Democrats will claim their title to be the party of peace. In other words, elect us as your next president or for the presidency, and we will end the war. Okay, and this is actually, I don't think it's too hard for us to believe that there's a lot of people in the United States at this point who would like to end the war, who would like to see the bloodshed stop. And some of those groups are the following, right? They made appeals to the following groups. So anti-emancipationists, right? People who are against the Emancipation Proclamation would be good candidates, good people, good voters, right, to vote for a candidate who would claim to be a party of peace. Okay? But any peace is going to come with compromise. All right? So if peace is made, okay, and it's not through just unconditional surrender of the Confederacy, it is peace, a ceasefire, something like that. It's going to come with the North having to compromise on some issues. Okay, so emancipation could be one of those issues. After all, it was a military objective, it was a military aim to do that by Lincoln, and so its duration may not last past peace. Once peace is solved, the slaves go back to the plantations. It's sort of up in the air. So at this point, anyway, non-slave holding farmers, so the poor whites, those yeoman farmers who at this point may, through exhaustion of the war, just feel like they're being taken advantage of, if they haven't already, by the aristocrats, right? Those planters, the planter class in the South, right? The big slave owners. Because remember, most slaves are owned by a very, very small percentage of Southerners. And then what you call copperheads, which are peace Democrats, right? They want peace. They're against, in the same way we described the anti-emancipationists. They're basically pro-Southerners. And they want to see the war come to an end. They want to be rid of Lincoln and many of his policies. So nothing really would be different about what I already said. It's just to have a label on it. You could now refer to groups like anti-emancipationists, non-slave holding farmers as copperheads at the higher levels of actual government and politicking. So, good nominee for president would be a rival of Lincoln and somebody Lincoln fired, right, from the military very recently in the war because of his overly cautious nature. We described at Antietam, for example, is George B. McClellan, right? So General McClellan will run as the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. So let's switch gears to the Republicans and their platform. So additions to their pre-existing platform planks. So again, they haven't changed anything about the original planks from the 1850s. They still believe in no slavery in the West and all those other items that we discussed. But events in the war have provided for emancipation first. So that's been added. Now we're actually talking about freedom of slaves, okay? Because it's happened in January, right? January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued. So now emancipation is on the platform. It's there. Okay, so things have changed a bit for the Republicans. And everything they've done will live or die with the result of the war. If they're victorious in the war, emancipation has a better chance of success than if they're defeated in the war and defeated in the election. So the election of 1864, just to add some significance to this, runs completely parallel now to the war itself. Victory in the war for the Union could be victory in the election for the Republicans. Victory for the Democrats could be some recognition for the Confederacy as a nation in the world. Just a simple ceasefire would provide some credibility, as we said before. They've already tried, but failed, to gain some European recognition of their independence, but of course they didn't actually get that. So events in the war have dramatic shifts on both sides, but the Republicans desperately need victories on the battlefield. So again, if nothing else would tell you the significance behind the election of 1864 and the Civil War that's ongoing at the same time, it would be that the Republicans as a political party need victories on the battlefield to be successful in the election. Okay. You should play that back. I won't say it again. You should play that back because that's important, right? Republicans needing these victories, okay, to win the election. They finally get what they need with Sherman's march to the sea. So General Sherman is about to close up the only remaining real passageway for Southerners across the Appalachians and Georgia, which is a haven for industry. So, and not only will he do that, he will basically decimate everything in his path as he moves towards the Atlantic Ocean. It's nicknamed March to the Sea. He will then move north to South Carolina, which is where the war started. So there's a lot of intensity there when they get there, and they eventually stop when they hit North Carolina. In fact, many North Carolinians had written to Lincoln pleading with him to stop Sherman from his march because of the destruction there. And his order is basically to destroy everything but the people. So he's not supposed to harm the civilians. Okay, military, but he's not supposed to harm civilians, but his orders are to destroy everything. So ultimately, it is this and other battlefield victories in the summer of 1864 that pushes Lincoln and the Republican Party towards victory in both the executive and legislative branches. So it's not just the presidency, not the White House only, okay, but it also is Republican control of Congress. That's also at stake here. So the impacts are that Lincoln, of course, still wins. He wins with 55% of the popular vote, so relative to his 38%, or whatever he was exactly, I forget off the top of my head, about 40% at least that he got in 1860. Certainly there's more voters that are friendly to him now. The South has seceded, and of course is not voting in this election, so it's a little bit different. Remember that. Reinforces the Union's and the Republican Party's commitment to emancipation and preservation. And preservation of the Union. So again, because these are so united, right, with the stance, the platform they're standing on, and the war itself, winning the war means winning for these items too, right? Preservation of the Union is now really been voted in favor of by the people. By voting for Lincoln again, by voting for the Republican Party again to Congress, you are voting for emancipation, you are voting for the preservation of the Union, okay? Republicans maintain steep control in both the House and Congress. This is both houses of Congress. And this is very important, of course. It will be this heavily what they call radical Republican Congress. That will be the group that eventually ratifies the 13th Amendment, and that's the amendment that abolished slavery everywhere. It's actually the first amendment to abolish something that used to be protected directly by the Constitution, okay, by federal law. So it is a big one if you didn't already know that. So Lincoln's second inaugural address, if you read with me, this is a very important word. It speaks to a lot of what Lincoln probably intended for. Well, we know a lot more about it, obviously, but what he intends for the end of the war and what we call Reconstruction. Of course, he is tragically assassinated only a few months after this. So but this does give us a good window. These two excerpts are very famous ones. So fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge, and we should remember that, of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash, reference to slavery, shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, reference to war, to end slavery now, right? So he is speaking of the war and the idea of emancipation as being one and the same. As was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So a lot of religious associations made as well. The next one would be basically about reconciliation of these two sides in the war, in our civil war, right? With malice, with hatred, right? With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So, speaking of the soldiers, their families, I mean, over 600,000 soldiers will have died in this war. 3 million people are involved. All their families are involved. So Lincoln is definitely providing direction for what's to come, what should happen for these soldiers that remain, and their families that, of course, remain anyway, and how to really move on and through some unity with that. So he's trying to unify the country, and when he's making this inaugural address, it is before the end of the war, but he's already speaking as though the war has ended. Again, it goes back to what we said before about the election of 1864 having such an important parallel with the end of the war itself. So really, by winning the election of 1864, Lincoln's basically won the war. He really has. So it's just a matter of sort of cleaning up the loose ends. The loose end here would be, on the battlefield at least, that Lee remains. At this point, only Lee remains in Virginia. Everything else, through Sherman's march to the sea, through Grant in the west, now Grant is in the east, and he's trying at Petersburg in Virginia to finally cut Lee off, and he will, and eventually surrender will be made at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia between Lee and Grant. So a great line at the end of the war is that Lee comes in, he signs the surrender, hands over his sword. Right, we're imagining this big ceremony at Appomattox Courthouse, and Lee looks around at Grant's generals, Union generals, and he says to one that is actually Native American, his last name is Parker, I believe, and he says to him, "It's nice to see a real American here," referring to his being Native American. And Parker answers back to Lee, he says, "We are all Americans."